All right, so I hope if you grab your Bibles you'll follow along. Um, Deuteronomy chapter 1, verses 34 through 46 is where we'll be today. So we started this series last week through Deuteronomy called One Last Thing Before I Go. And we said that in Deuteronomy, Moses is packing his stuff. He is about to board the plane to eternity. He's preparing to forever leave his people, and so we illustrated that we're standing in Terminal E for eternity, and Moses is getting on the plane, and then as the doors are closing, Moses steps back from the jetway, and he stands on a chair, and he says, "Hey, one last thing before I go." And so Deuteronomy is the last thing Moses says before he goes. It's not a short thing, but it is his final farewell speech. And so we said last week that the first thing he says was, remember, all was well before you until you doubted God's love. All was well with you until you doubted God's love. And you can hear that message on the Water's Edge YouTube page if you did not get to hear it last week. So the second thing Moses says that I want to talk about today is he says, remember, God was angry yet gracious. God was angry yet gracious. And so he says this by pointing them back to the story of them entering the promised land or about to enter the promised land for the first time. And they are terrified to go in, and they disbelieve God, they disbelieve Moses. And so as a result, God says, all right, you're not going in. In fact, you won't go in at all. Your descendants, your children will go in, but you will not. And so when the people heard Moses tell them this, that they're not going to go in, they quickly changed their mind and said, we're sorry, we did wrong, but we want a second chance and we want to go in now. And what's interesting that I want to talk about today is that this sudden change of direction is not acceptable to God. In fact, it seems that God rather coldly says, no, sorry, you had one chance and you lost it. Okay, but as we're going to look a little deeper today, we find that this was not quite the case. Okay, and so this is a story I want to consider today, and I want to consider it by considering three things. Number one, I want us to see change that God rejects. Change God rejects, change God accepts, and then lastly, I want to talk about the means to acceptable change. So let's talk about the kind of change that God rejects as seen from this story here. So this story that George read is actually first recorded in Numbers 14. Again, Deuteronomy is kind of a retelling of the law. It's called the second law, in fact. We see the Ten Commandments spoken there again. So it's a second law. So Numbers 14 is where it was first recorded. In Numbers 14, it says that they rose early in the morning after they had sinned and not done what God asked them to do. They rose early in the morning and went up to the top of the mountain saying, here we are. And they approach Moses and they say, here we are, and we'll go up to the place which the Lord has promised, for we have sinned. And so it seems that overnight they became convicted that they really messed things up. They probably didn't sleep, right? They felt regret. They felt remorse. They said to themselves, we had the promised land at our fingertips and we lost it. And when you feel regret like this, it can absolutely motivate you to change. Okay, I had a conversation recently or one time with a gentleman who was trying to discern what he should do career-wise. He was pretty unsatisfied with his present job, and his unsatisfaction led him to force him to kind of reflect on the previous job that he had lost because of his drinking problem. And so when he finally realized just what a good job he lost, he said to himself, I'm going to go back and I'm going to just own what I did, and maybe they'll give me my job back. And so that's exactly what he did, and they gave him his job back. So when you realize, like he did, that your actions cause you to lose something that you really wanted, it can absolutely cause you to change in your life. But I want you to see this, okay? This type of, we'll call it level 1 change, can never change who you are. It only changes what you do, okay? This type of change where you realize I've lost something I've wanted because of my own sin, it can absolutely change your behavior, but it does not change who you are. And so to illustrate this, I know that it doesn't make a lot of sense unless we can apply it here. To illustrate this, I want the people who understand this best, I believe, are people who've been in an abusive relationship before. So whenever I work with couples who have had an abusive relationship, first of all, they're usually separated by the time they come to see me, and necessarily so. But if we just talk for a moment, we're talking about an abusive marriage. If we just talk for a moment about the woman in the abusive relationship, she has usually endured physical or emotional abuse, and she almost always has this undying hope that her husband will change. And so in physically abusive relationships, for example, there's always a 3-part abuse cycle that's rather predictable. So the first part of the cycle is, we'll call it the tension building stage, where stresses are building and tempers are getting more and more heated. And this stage may last an hour, or it may last a whole week. The second stage, though, is the acute violence stage, where the actual abuse happens. This is when the cops are called, and this is where it gets ugly. And then the third stage, we'll call it the remorse stage. And in the remorse stage, I want to quote from Grant Martin, who's a PhD in psychology. And so he says this about the abuse stage. He says, the remorse stage. He says, the husband in this remorse stage may apologize profusely, try to help his wife, show kindness and remorse, and shower her with gifts and promises that will never happen again. This behavior often comes out of a genuine sense of guilt over the harm inflicted, as well as fear of losing his wife. He says the husband at this point may really believe he will never allow himself to be violent again, and the wife very much wants to believe this as well. And so the level of intimacy during this make-up phase may actually be better than any other time in their lives. They may communicate feelings in the context of guilt and vulnerability that usually aren't communicated. And while the couple is sharing mutual feelings of closeness and protectiveness, they tend to believe everything is okay, the problem's been solved, and the violence will not occur again. This ray of hope phenomenon, Grant says, and the belief that love is enough, contribute a couple to believing they do not need any outside help. So in this third stage, okay, the wife is duped into continuing the relationship without a separation or without any kind of outside intervention. No one knows about the abuse. It's kept hidden under the belief that it'll never happen again. It was just a hiccup. And the wife is duped in this way because, unlike God, she believes, or she really wants to believe, that the change she is seeing in her husband is true change. But inevitably, okay, the cycle eventually starts again whenever the husband begins to feel more secure that his wife won't leave him, and whenever life stressors build up again. Well, so in the story that we are reading this morning, okay, the story Moses is retelling, the Israelites had one night to think about what they had done. They came back to God in the morning, apologizing profusely out of a place of genuine guilt. They offered to do whatever God wanted them to do, gifts, penance, you name it. They shared with Moses their true heart and eager desire to change. And finally, they promised it would never happen again, saying, please give us a second chance. Okay? And God says, I ain't falling for it. Folks, this is change God rejects. It's level 1 change. And in level 1 change, visible change happens for a time, and to the average human eye, the change appears permanent. But God knows better, and so God says to these Israelites, he says, I'm not changing my mind. You're not entering the promised land. Your children will enter it instead. And don't you dare try to go in on your own, or I'll make you flee with your tails between your legs. And that's exactly what happens. Okay? So change God rejects is a change in what you do, but not a change in who you are. And many people will fall for level 1 change as true change, but I want you to know God rejects it. Okay? Now, another thing I want you to see about change God rejects is change that you can bring about on your own. Okay? Deuteronomy 1 verse 41 says, the people said, we've sinned against the Lord. We will go up and fight just as the Lord commanded us. And the Lord said to me, do not go up nor fight, for I'm not among you, lest you be defeated before your enemies, and yet you would not listen. Now again, folks, on the surface, this looks like true, genuine change, right? They confess their sins, and they clearly have a resolve to do better. But true change, God knows, is never that simple. Notice that the Israelites seem to narrow down their problem to a lack of personal confidence. They approach Moses in the morning, and after they've had some time to think about it, and they say, we weren't confident that we could do it yesterday, but overnight our confidence has been restored, and now we're ready. And as happy as we are to see them, ready to obey, God knows this is not true change. So let's go back to the abuse analogy for a moment. Okay? Whenever an abuser abuses his wife, he's not changed or even begun to change. If he concludes, honey, I just let my temper get out of control. I know what I've done now. I should have just separated myself for a time and come back, and I would not have been so mad. Okay? This is not change God accepts. And if the wife takes this as genuine change, because he's repented, he's cried, he feels really, really bad, he makes new passionate promises, and he says, I'm really going to try this time. If she takes this as genuine change, she's going to be abused again. Why? Because her husband has said, I can bring about change on my own. I don't need help. I don't have a problem. I don't need anyone to tell me what to do. I just need to get my butt in gear and do the right things. And in saying this, he has narrowed down his problem to a lack of personal strength and confidence. So when the Israelites begin to gird on their swords, they repent. They know what they did was wrong. They say, we're going to do right next time. They have a plan. They give a passionate plea to Moses that they're ready to make up for it. They probably even promise never to do it again. But God's not having it. Why? Because they aren't changed. Okay? They believe they can bring about change in themselves on their own, so much so that they're going to go try round 2 without God's help. Okay? Moses specifically said to them, God's not going with you. And they said, oh, fine, we'll do it on our own. Okay? Folks, change God rejects is change you feel you can bring about on your own. Okay? You don't need help. You don't need anyone else to assist you. You believe you can do it with or without God. You don't need to listen to advice or counsel. You don't need to share with anyone your personal stuff. You got this. And as a result, folks, the Israelites ignored Moses' direct command, and they went to fight anyway. So change God rejects, first of all, is a change in what you do, but not a change in who you are. Change God rejects is change you believe you can bring about on your own. And then a third thing about change God rejects here is this level 1 change. This is change that is simply concerned in the end with a return to normalcy. It is change that is simply concerned with a return to normalcy. And so the abusive husband says, I don't want you to leave me. I don't want the family disrupted. I don't want things to change because of this. I can't live without you, so I'll do whatever it takes to keep you. Or in the Israelites' case, We don't want to lose the promised land. Okay? We don't want to live here in the desert. We don't want to wander for the next 38 years. We want things to go back to the way they were supposed to be. So change God rejects is change that is simply concerned with a return to normalcy. And if normalcy cannot be returned to for someone who's not actually changed, this will often result in getting angry. Okay? The husband feels his wife has no right to leave him, and now he blames her for the breakup and not himself. Okay? Or in the Israelites' case, it's likely that the Israelites were angry that God said the original plan could not be returned to. In fact, in verse 43, if you have your Bibles, Moses said, "So I spoke to you, yet you would not listen, but you rebelled against the command of the Lord and presumptuously went up into the mountain." So this word presumptuously here in the Hebrew means to seethe or to be insolent, to be proud or to deal proudly. Okay? So the Israelites were told that things could not return to normal, and they were angry, and so they took matters into their own hands. They said, "This is ridiculous. Why can't we go up? Why can't we just move on?" Right? They acted presumptuously. They presumed they had a right to the promised land even after they sinned. And this is where a wife, folks, if she's thinking clearly, will get angry at her husband and say, "Do you think that everything can just return to normal just like that? You have no idea how much you've hurt me." So, folks, change that God rejects is change in what you do without a subsequent change in who you are. It's change that you believe you can bring about on your own with or without God's help. Okay? And thirdly, it's change that is simply concerned with a return to normalcy. And so let's apply this here to our present coronavirus situation, because I think there's a strong application. I want to quote here from Pastor Jonathan Cahn, who wisely observed that the change that happened in America after 9/11 was this level one change only. He said, and I think you'd agree with this, he said, people flocked into churches after 9/11. Talk of God was wider and more acceptable after 9/11 than it was before. Prayer was more public and acceptable. People even made new promises to live differently after 9/11. But Kahn says the change did not last. Why? Well, for at least three reasons. Number one, it did not result in a change in who we are. It did not. It was change that we believed that we could bring about on our own. And when it was all said and done, all we were really after in perhaps returning to church or begging God for mercy, all we were really after was a return to normalcy. And you know, that's a hard pill to swallow right now, because there's not a single one of us that does not want a return to normalcy right now. Okay. And so I want to suggest that maybe a return to normal is not something God wants for us. Maybe there was something wrong with our normal that this time of abnormality should really force us to think about. And so here's just a few things that I note that we really need to sit with for a while. First of all, as it relates to recovery, almost every recovery program in Laconia today, with the exception of CR, is concerned only with changing what you do and preaches there's absolutely nothing wrong with who you are. Also, almost every recovery program in Laconia believes the change you need to implement in your life is change you can bring about on your own. But then thirdly, as it relates to the economy, folks, I think it's safe to say that our economy should not return to the way it used to be, because the majority of Americans today do not see their jobs as their way of loving God by loving their neighbor as themselves. Most Christians I know do not approach their work this way. American jobs are about making money and making a name for ourselves, two things God never intended human work to be about. So if that's our normal, folks, then our normal needs to change, okay? And that's hard. That's a hard gut check. That if that's what we're going to return to, maybe God doesn't want that moment. Okay? So this is change, folks, that God rejects. It is a change in what we do, but not a change in who we are. It's a desire to return to normalcy alone and not true change. And then lastly, it's change that we believe that we can bring about on our own. So that's change God rejects, all things that the Israelites in this incident were guilty of. So let's talk then about what does change that God accepts look like? Well, since the Israelites, we don't actually see the Israelites change in this passage, we actually have to look somewhere else to see an example of change that God accepts. So, and I want to do this by turning to the book of Jonah real quick. You don't need to turn there, but I want to read a few verses from the book of Jonah. This is Jonah chapter 3 and verse 3. It says here that when Jonah's warning reached the king of Nineveh, he arose from his throne, took off his royal robes, covered himself with sackcloth and ashes, and sat down in the dust. This is the proclamation he issued in Nineveh. By the decree of the king and his nobles, do not let people or animals, herds or flocks taste anything. Do not let them eat or drink, but let people and animals be covered with sackcloth. Let everyone call urgently on God. Let them give up their evil ways and their violence. Who knows? God may relent and with compassion turn from his fierce anger so that we will not perish. And when God saw what they did and how they turned from their evil ways, he relented and did not bring on them the destruction he had promised, or he had threatened. So you may be familiar with that story, you may not be, but this is a remarkable true change story in the Bible, in particular because the city of Nineveh at the time was a very wicked city. Okay, Nineveh was a violent place where only the strong survived, and yet they experienced true change that God accepted. So I want us to notice three things about change God accepts from this story. First of all, notice the removal of the king's robes. It says the king of Nineveh rose from his throne and took off his royal robes. The king of Nineveh was willing to step down from his throne and say, I'm not too good for grace and mercy. In fact, I need them. He did not presumptuously say, chill out, Jonah, you act like we're some kind of monsters here. Have you seen the Moabites over there and how they're living? Okay. He did not justify his city. He didn't compare his city to others. He didn't arrogantly believe that his city could bring about the change on their own through their own policy implementation. Okay? Instead, the king of Nineveh bowed. He bowed to a God he discovered he was completely indebted to and ultimately accountable to. And so this is remarkable, folks. Something broke in the king's heart in the hearing of Jonah's preaching. He became, as Jesus said, poor in spirit. Okay? He humbled himself. And any tangible change that followed in Nineveh flowed out of a change in who the king was, not just what the king did. So he became broken and dependent on a power greater than himself. Okay? So that's the first thing I want you to. The second thing I want you to see is I want us to notice from this change story the wearing of sackcloth. Okay? Sackcloth and ashes were always worn as a sign of mourning. So either mourning for the dead or mourning for personal or national sin. Okay? Sackcloth was this coarse material usually made of goat's hair and usually black in color. And so the sackcloth was either worn as a robe would be worn, or sometimes it was laid down on the ground and slept on all night. Okay, but so here's the important part of sackcloth and ashes, though. Sackcloth was worn as a symbol of the repentance which they preached. And so this is important to understand here. You do not wear sackcloth and ashes if you want to keep your sin hidden. You do not wear sackcloth and ashes if you want to keep your sin hidden. When you put on sackcloth and ashes, you are in a sense confessing to the world that you're a sinner and you deserve God's judgment. You see, an abuser wants his sin covered, right? He doesn't want anybody to know about it. He doesn't want his wife to mention it to anybody. He doesn't want his wife to talk about it with anyone. He wants his sin covered. But in Nineveh, the entire city, including the animals, were covered in sackcloth, which means they were done covering up their sin. Instead, they were ready to confess it and expose it and accept the consequences thereof. This, folks, is change God accepts. There's no more covering up. Change God accepts is change flowing from a brokenness and poorness of spirit as seen in the king. But change God accepts is also change with full exposure. Okay, no more covering up, no more making things out to be better than they actually are, no more keeping secrets. And so do you want to know if somebody's really changed? One of the things you're looking for is, are they willing to be completely open and honest with anyone about what they've done? Do they believe that the only way to be free of their sin is to bring it into the light and let it be seen? Are they willing to wear a sackcloth and ashes t-shirt that says, "This is who I was, but because of Jesus Christ, this is now who I am"? Are they willing to, if your husband wants to keep the abuse a secret, folks, or ma'am, he's not changed, okay? One of the most powerful components of Celebrate Recovery is our testimonies, okay? And a CR testimony is a full exposure. When a person gives their testimony, they put on figurative sackcloth and ashes, and they because they're making openly known what they've done. And if you went to our CR rally back in January, you heard the power of a testimony, okay? So change God accepts is change flowing from a brokenness and poorness of spirit. Change God accepts is change with full exposure, okay? Sackcloth and ashes. But notice one last thing about change God accepts. Notice that the Ninevites did not presume they deserved a return to normalcy. In verse 9 they said, "Who knows? God may relent and with compassion turn from his fierce anger so that we will not perish." So the Ninevites did not presume they deserved for things to return to normal. Okay? They were not expecting God to relent or expecting that he should relent. They said, "Who knows? God may relent and with compassion turn." You know what an abuser says? An abuser says, "Oh my goodness, how many times do I have to say I'm sorry? Would you get over it already?" Okay? An abuser expects to be acquitted. He expects to be forgiven. In fact, he thinks he deserves forgiveness, and he gets angry if things can't return to normal. But the Ninevites, folks, did not believe for 1 minute that they deserved God's forgiveness. They knew they deserved what was coming to them, and if it came, well, then they would take whatever consequences was right for them to take. They did not feel they were entitled to normalcy again. They asked God to be compassionate and merciful, but they did not believe they deserved God to be compassionate and merciful. And so, do you want true evidence that someone's changed? And I've seen this happen a few times in marriages. Whenever a husband says, "I don't deserve to have my wife back. If she leaves, I completely understand. I won't be angry if she leaves. I won't blame her if she leaves. In fact, that's probably what she should do because I don't deserve to be married to a person I would treat in this way." When a husband says this, folks, something has happened to him. He's become broken and poor in spirit. He's ready to expose it, and he does not expect forgiveness. He doesn't expect it. Okay? He says, basically, who knows? Maybe she'll relent, but maybe she won't. Okay? So, folks, if the Israelites truly had a change of heart in this Deuteronomy scene, they would have come to Moses in the morning and they would have said, "Moses, tell God we don't deserve to enter the promised land. Okay? We understand our penalty. Our penalty is just. It's right. It's what we deserve. But would you pray to God on our behalf? For who knows? God may relent and with compassion turn from his fierce anger, and let us go in still. Folks, this would have been change that God accepted. It's change flowing from a brokenness of spirit. It's change with full exposure, no more hiding. And lastly, it's change with no expectation of a return to normalcy. So change God rejects, change God accepts. And I want to close our time here by talking about the means to acceptable change. How do we get to this kind of change in our lives personally, in our city, and beyond? In Luke chapter 7, a, quote, sinful woman entered the house of a Pharisee where Jesus was eating. And it says she brought an alabaster flask of fragrant oil and stood at his feet behind him weeping. And she began to wash his feet with her tears and wipe them with the hair of her feet, hair of her head. And she kissed his feet and anointed them with the fragrant oil. Okay. So this woman, in all honesty, had likely been abused in her life. She'd been taken advantage of. She'd been used. She was a, quote, sinful woman, which means she was sexually promiscuous. People had done things to her, but in truth, she had done things to people too. And the result in her life was probably the feeling that people hated her. Why would people do what they've done to me if they didn't hate me? But the second result was that she probably believed God hated her too. And so when she comes to Jesus this night, she comes as broken Nineveh. Okay? She knows she deserves God's judgment. She feels the pain of impending rejection. She had probably given up hope of ever being loved by people, but she seemed to hold out at least some hope that perhaps God would love her still. And so as she enters the Pharisee's house, she's probably said to herself, I'm going to go in there and give Jesus what Jesus is due, my whole self. I've not lived for him in the way I should. I've hurt him. I don't deserve to have him accept me. In fact, I deserve to have him reject me, but who knows? God may relent and with compassion turn from his fierce anger so that I will not perish. And in this brokenness of spirit, she anoints Jesus with oil. She says, I've been abused in my life, but in truth, I'm an abuser as well. I've injured my Lord with my sins. And Jesus looks down at her, and in the presence of the Pharisees says, this is change I accept. Your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Do you want to know the means to acceptable change, folks? It's this gospel right here. It's the awareness that God was justifyingly angry with me, yet he chose to be gracious and save me instead. It's the awareness that rather than give me what I deserve, God gave Jesus what I deserve and saved me. It's the awareness that deserving nothing, he gave me everything, his very son. It's the awareness that I don't deserve for him to take me back, but he loved me so much to buy me back with his own blood. It's the awareness that we don't deserve for God to return the world to normalcy, to the normalcy of the Garden of Eden. But in Jesus Christ, the Garden of Eden shall one day be restored. It's the awareness that we are all abusers, deserving God, the rejection of our God because of our sin. But in his great compassion and love, he washed us of all of our sin. And folks, the more you let this gospel sink deep into your heart, the more it changes you as a person. The more you let this gospel sink deep into your heart, the more it changes you as a person. And so as we prepare to take communion together, I hope that you have the grape juice and bread in front of you at home. As we prepare to surround communion, let me ask you, does God want things to return to normal for you? Does God want things to return to normal for you? Was your normal before the coronavirus acceptable to God? Have you in truth been following a different God than the God of the Bible? Have you been after a different thing than Jesus Christ himself? Has your job been nothing more than a means to make money for you? Folks, as Christians, we don't get to do anything for the making of money. You must do everything you do to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And if money is what drives you to work, you cannot serve God and money at the same time. If you want God to return you to that kind of normal, you're wanting something I think God doesn't want. So, would you ask God, if this is you, to give you the right heart and the right motivations for all you do? Would you approach him not presumptuously as if he has to hear you and answer your prayer, but with the humility of spirit that knows it is by grace alone that we receive anything from him? Let me ask you this: what sins are you still covering up? What things are happening at home that you really need to expose in order to find healing? What help are you refusing that you really need to accept? Would you come to Jesus today weeping and wash his feet with your tears? Would you say, Jesus, I don't deserve your grace, but I ask for it, for I have heard that you are gracious and compassionate, and that the kingdom of heaven belongs to those who are poor in spirit. Would you come to him today? Would you bow your knee? Would you repent? Would you confess to worshiping idols, the idols of money, the idols of sex, the idols of power, the idols of your own wisdom and knowledge that you've relied on for too long? Maybe you need to begin your walk with Christ today and be baptized. Folks, Jesus will not reject you if you come to him in this brokenness. He won't. In fact, he's waiting for you to come. He longs for you to come. In fact, he came to you first. So as we take communion right now, what do you need to do? What confessions do you need to make? What prayers do you need to lift to God during this time of communion? Well, the time of communion, you'll hear the music play. And if you would, just grab the bread and the juice, and either with your family or by yourself, take those together. And when the music stops playing, we will reconvene.